What's up, Kingdom of Rock? This is Matt Gibson, and I'm here today with Michael Melenda and guitarist, producer, musician, manager Bill Cutler. Bill, is there anything that you have not done in the music industry? I was trying to figure out how do I describe Bill Cutler to Kingdom of Rock?
Well, I started as a singer-songwriter, and then I kind of switched from acoustic to electric music, and then I became a record producer. And for a while, I did A&R and some managing, but I had 3 record deals along the way as an artist too. So a lot of different things. You know, I've written some liner notes. I've done lots of other things, but mostly I'm a singer-songwriter and record producer.
Yeah, it was always, Bill and I have known each other for probably more decades than we'd like to admit. And Bill was always kind of like the standard in the San Francisco rock scene, because we'd all go like, oh man, we want to be singer-songwriters. Oh crap, Bill did it. Or we want to be in a band. Oh crap, Bill did it. Oh, we want to be record producers. Oh crap, Bill did it. You know, it's just, he was always beating everybody to the next big thing, you know.
Well, I certainly I wasn't the first into punk rock, that's for sure. You know,
neither was I, unfortunately.
Yeah, right.
The San Francisco community, because you go even deeper, with your brother who worked for the Grateful Dead. So kind of seeing how the San Francisco community has morphed. I mean, I don't want to get too into this because we want to make sure that we're giving knowledge out to our community out there. But you have a really almost individual view about what's special about the San Francisco rock scene.
Yeah. I came here in '67 the first time, and it was the summer of love. And I tripped around and I went, wow, this is just an incredible thing. And having grown up in New York, I recognized that this was the place that was happening at the moment, the way that the Village had been maybe 5 years earlier, you know? And I went back and forth for 2 or 3 years, because I couldn't afford to live out here. But I met a lot of people. On my second trip out here in '68, I met Jerry Garcia at the Matrix. We had like a 5-minute conversation, but it turned me on to what people were doing out here, And at that point, all of these bands were very approachable. That all those layers that are between people and bands didn't exist then. And in New York, you had all of these separate little groups of people who were in their own little cliques. And when you came to San Francisco, it was like one giant tribe. You might play in one band and he might play in another, and some woman was a singer in another one, but they always played together on the bill. They supported each other. They had almost the feel of a union of music people, and that really appealed to me. And that was the first thing that seemed special to me about the music scene out here, was that it wasn't so competitive in the way that bands were fighting with each other, and it was much more like they were supporting each other to build one scene up,
Mm-hmm. Hey, Bill, just a technical question. I think your mic is hitting against your keyboard or something. We're hearing some clicks in there.
Oh, it sounds like some metal rubbing together or something.
Well, how does that sound?
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Okay.
We just want to make sure all your brilliant words don't get that the drum solo doesn't affect it.
Yeah.
Well, so I know, like, one thing that Michael talks a lot about is the differences of music scenes now versus music scenes back in the 60s and 70s, and how, there was kind of a culture around the city, based on the music scene there in a different way than there is now. Would you agree with that? What was your experience with that?
Of course, I would agree with that, because there were so many venues. There were so many people participating in the music scene and the culture scene around the music. And we would all see each other really frequently. And you got to know people. And as the music scene built, and certainly after the Monterey Pop Festival, once Columbia started signing all those acts through Clive Davis, there was an incredible feeling that San Francisco was just exploding. It was the place to be. And it was unique. I mean, there were a lot of small clubs that became very influential in the '70s. the Shady Grove on Haight Street and Cat's Cradle. They were little places, but they had bands like Moby Grape and stuff. You know, they had bands that were really great bands that could play bigger venues, and it created this feeling that there was less of a barrier between the audience and the musicians than there was in a place like New York or Boston or somewhere on the East Coast. You know, that to me was very different. Then after things really changed and the business became super corporate, all the venues that couldn't survive just started disappearing, and everything went into the hands of a much smaller group of people that were controlling everything. You know, you had Graham booking an awful lot of places. You had the Keystone Corner and Keystone Palo Alto and the Stone and all that. They were all booked by Freddie Herrera and his crowd, and they were great, but it wasn't the same thing. It wasn't as independent as it used to be. And all of a sudden it was much more competitive, and it was harder to emerge, you know? It was, that would be the way I would put it, you know?
Well, when you had access to all these people, like the Brotherhood of San Francisco, so to speak, when did you start to absorb things as a singer-songwriter? Was there any cross-collateralization as far as your inspiration at all, or were you kind of on your own trying to find your own style, or a combination of both?
Well, it's interesting. Maybe it's a combination of both. Growing up in New York, I was a disciplined singer-songwriter. I spent a lot of time in Greenwich Village opening shows for people like Eric Anderson and Dylan and stuff in little places like the Gaslight Cafe and the Bitter End and Gertie's and stuff. And I was an acoustic songwriter, but my songs were disciplined 3.5-minute songs. And then in the daytime, I would go over to the Brill Building, where all of the publishers existed, and I'd be knocking on doors all day trying to get a publishing deal. And of course, they'd be throwing me out of there. I'm 17, 18 years old. You know, they didn't need me. They had Carole King and Neil Sedaka, you know, and Cleveland Stoller. But I was trying. But I developed this disciplined sound. When I came out to San Francisco and I bumped into the Grateful Dead and the New Riders and all these other people, they said, hey, you know, we got 3 chords and we jam on them for 30 minutes. You've got a 6-chord song and it's 4 minutes. How about if we meet in the middle and you open up the middle part? And it was great for me because it opened me up to other possibilities of what I could do with my stuff. I didn't feel like I had to navigate everything. And that collision of discipline and experimentation was unique in a way. You know, there were people who were in one camp or the other, but I was sort of in both. And I early on was influenced by Dylan. I was influenced by the Love and Spoonful. I lived in New York, you know, the Beatles, Stones, Carole King, all kinds of things. And once I got out here and I met all these musicians, I kind of let some of that go, and I just let myself go on a journey with them, you know, where it took me. You know, wherever it took me.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the impressive things about you, you know, when we kind of met in the New Age era is, you know, you did so much homework. Like, I mean, you never produced one of my records, but I had worked with producers where, you know, they would kind of come in and just, you had to kind of obey them because maybe they were a little bit better than you, but they didn't really do the work. And I just remember talking to you, and you would go over the band's songs, you know, just super detailed wise, and you would worry about kick drum sounds and this and that, and you would have these charts and stuff. I mean, it was like going to school almost.
Well, that's nice of you to say that. I've always believed that great records are made when you do a ton of pre-production. You have a wonderful song, you know what you want to do with it. You're so familiar with it. And when I say familiar, I mean everybody in the band, the producer, the engineer. You could play it in a coma. And you go into the studio, and then if extra inspiration strikes, that's fine. But if it doesn't, you already have a bass line. You know what you're going to do with the song. The drummer isn't hesitating going into the chorus, wondering if he should play the machine gun fill. He's made his decision already. He's going to play it or he's not going to play it. And whatever you do in music, in recording, you can always feel the mood of the person recording. So, for example, if you're insecure, you may hit every note perfectly, but your vocal's not going to be compelling. And if you're questioning what you're doing, you're not going to be hitting your drums the way you do when you're absolutely positive of what you want to do. Same with a guitar player or anything else. So that's one reason I do a lot of pre-production. The other reason is because I want to get so familiar with the band that they sort of forget I'm there. And they start playing the way they do at 3 a.m. after they smoked a joint, come home from the gig and sit down on the couch and play. Because I love it when people play like that. I love it when they just play without worrying about how it's coming off or what someone's going to think of it later, you know? And to get to that point, you have to set a mood as a producer where that kind of magic can happen. And all the great producers that I saw work before I tried to produce, they could all do that. I was thinking of Elliot Mazer today because he just passed away, you know, and I knew him. And he was a wonderful guy. And he did that. And he created that atmosphere for Neil Young on Harvest, you know, that allowed Neil Young to do that. And part of the job of a producer is to create that atmosphere. And the rest of it is to know the stuff so well that you're like an extra member of the band and they respect you because you know the material. And if you say to one of the guys, you know, I think that you're overplaying this solo, they don't panic and think, well, you don't know what we're supposed to sound like, man. This is what we, you know, you already know what they sound like. You've been to 24 rehearsals, you know, you've made a lot of notes. You could play the songs yourself if you had to. And so that's always been my approach, you know, and as things got more and more digital, people became less willing to do that kind of work. You know, I would start meeting these young bands and they'd say to me, we're hiring you because we love the bands from your era, the Stones, and we love, I don't know, the Yardbirds, and we love Led Zeppelin. And I said, well, look, man, Led Zeppelin played the song all the way through. So I said, you want to play one verse and you want me to copy that verse 3 times.
Right.
And of course it will be perfect, but it won't be rock and roll.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And those are 2 different things. So when I say that I'm trying to get people to give great performances, I don't mean perfect performances. I could do that on a drum machine, you know? I mean emotionally perfect performances.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
No, that draw you in.
Yeah. Because when Matt and I had Pete Anderson on, who produced all those great Dwight Yoakam records.
Yeah.
You know, he's a clipboard guy. You know, he was very clear about, I'm a clipboard guy. I've got my notes. It's going to be the way that I think it's going to be. But the other thing that, from what you were saying, was I heard Dave Grohl on Howard Stern yesterday, and Howard Stern asked him why the Rolling Stones are called the greatest rock and roll band, and it was funny because Dave Grohl said, well, you know, when you see them in concert, it's like they do the first 2 songs and you wonder what are they playing? I don't even know what that song is, and then all of a sudden the second song, boom, you know, like they look at each other and they don't even have to have a script. They just feel exactly where that song's going to go. And Mick will look at Keith and all of a sudden they'll go in a different direction. And that's all feeling. That's all emotion. That's all gut. That's all a group of musicians working together to create something new every single time.
Yes. And it's familiarity and trust. You don't have that unless you have the trust of the guy who's playing the other instrument. One of the most interesting things Tom Petty says at the end of Running Down a Dream, what's like a 3 or 4 hour documentary on the history of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, you know? And the guy says to him, well, what's the most important thing that you learned in all your years in music? He said, the guy standing next to you on stage is a whole lot more important than you thought he was. And that's the way I feel about music. I like the group experience. I mean, I made a solo record, and that's fine. But I didn't spend most of my career as a solo artist. I spent most of my performing career in bands, because to me, that's where the excitement is. There's nothing like standing on a big stage like standing at the first Hay Street Fair, for example, where I played with my band Heroes, and Jerry Miller was our lead guitar player at the time from Moby Grape, and he's so great. And we get up there, and you hit that first A chord, and the whole band lands on it together. It's just so exciting. It's such magic. You don't get that when you're by yourself. Even if you play all the instruments, you never quite have that coalition happening, So that's how I look at it.
Yeah. I know, like, I've been doing a lot of music by myself during the COVID crisis, and it's just not the same of being in a room of people playing music and creating together. I mean, it's cool. It has its own discipline, And by the way, Bill, your mic, I think what's happening is it's hitting the shirt and it sounds scratchy.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So when you move, there it goes. That'll fix it. Yeah,
okay.
Totally.
Well, that's a good question for you, Bill, too. Like Matt brought up, let's take it. All of us are doing a lot of music by trading tracks back and forth.
Right.
How does an artist circumvent that to actually deliver amazing tracks? I mean, what advice would you give to someone who's recording solely at home, trading tracks to get that kind of vibe you're talking about in the studio? When a band's playing together.
Yeah. Well, if you do a basic track in pieces, you really have to visualize in your mind what you want and learn how to articulate to the other player what you're looking for. But you still have to give them room to be creative and do what they want. So I usually ask people when I'm working that way to deliver me 3 or 4 performances and let me chop them up to get what I like the most out of them. Big sections, but like, I love the way you approach the first verse on take 1. You did terrific on the bridge on the 3rd take. And, you're basically playing the same thing for me on drums or whatever it is that your instrument. And I'll just take the big pieces and use those. I mean, now that we're in a digital realm, I'm talking about, with analog, you could do that, but it was such a project, Now you can preview everything in digital and it's not prohibitive to do it. But that's one thing. The other thing is I try to get at least on a rhythm section, a bass player and a drummer to play together, whatever I have to do, because I hate the idea of overdubbing drums on bass or overdubbing bass on drums, because I consider the bass and drums a machine together. The kick drum and the bass work together. And the only way you have the freedom to really test out different patterns is if you have both of them there to try, So that's the most difficult thing. I mean, I know a lot of great guitar players, and I can send them one of my songs with my rhythm guitar parts, bass, and drums on there, and I can trust them to send me back a bunch of stuff, and there'll be some great solos in there, and there'll be some great figures that I can use as hooks and things, because they're playing over something that's already got a vibe and already has certain structure and feel to it. But it's so hard to do it with bass and drums. Now, interestingly enough, when COVID hit, I was working on some new material for myself, and I had gone down to my friend Mark Five's studio down in Pasadena. And the way we did it was we laid down a drum machine. We wrote a beat that we believed really was the right groove for the song, tempo. I played my rhythm guitar parts. Then we brought in a great bass player, Corey McCormick, who plays with Lucas Nelson in The Promise of the Real.
Awesome.
And he, also with Neil Young and everything. And he's terrific. He came in, he had such a great feel. And over in the drum machine, I said to him, so this is what the drums are going to be like, but with more life. He said, okay. And we did 4 or 5 takes. He was spectacular, cut a few things together. Now we had bass, rhythm guitar, and machine drums. But of course, I wanted a real drummer. So now we went out and found Gordon Campbell, who's a phenomenal drummer down in LA. We went to his studio. We played him this much, let him lay his drums over it, but with me there, and so that at least there was that much communication. And Mark was there co-producing and engineering with me, and that came out really well. But it's hard. It's never, it's harder.
Yeah, because Matt's working on a record, and it's going to turn out fine. But because he's had to, and he can talk about it, but because he's had to get stuff piecemeal, it's not like he hasn't had his challenges making sure everything's the way he wants it. So I love the fact that you're at least able, whether you're in the studio with the person or having a Zoom meeting with the person. I guess it's pretty important that you at least talk to the drummer or talk to the bass player while they're laying your track down.
Of course, and it's become. It's a lot of these famous drummers like Kenny Aronoff and guys like that, they'll tell you, just send me your track and I'll put drums on it and send it back to you. And I'm like, I don't want to do that, even if it's a drummer I love, because I've never seen a record that didn't get better when there was communication.
Yeah, I totally can relate to that. Like what I did is I laid down a click track. I already have the rhythm, all the guitars written and the vocals written. So I did like first pass, I did a click track with me playing the song and singing it at the same time. And then I sent that to a drummer who was world-class drummer. I mean, incredible drummer, right? And I got it back. And I was like, maybe change this a little bit or whatever. And then I had a bass player lay down a track with that, and it made a good demo, but it wasn't what I wanted. And so it enabled me to start up some conversations with other musicians that I got to be on the track now. And so it kind of like, now I'm going to start over with the drums and the bass. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your advice and I'm going to have the drums and bass recorded in the same room.
Yeah. That's always the best option if you can
do it over the guitars and vocals over.
Well, I think the thing too, Bill, you can make give us some wisdom on this is, now that we're COVID, we have access to, you can call Kenny Aronoff and he'll give you a drum track if you can write the check,
Right.
But it doesn't mean the song's going to be awesome.
Right.
So just having a name, it means someone's got more experience, but it doesn't mean they're going to get the vibe and all that. So kind of what you're talking about is being able to talk to whoever it is, whether it's a superstar drummer, a bass player or not.
Exactly.
Is your vision, because vibe's so important. And actually to that point, because Matt just reminded me when he said demo, what do you feel separates a master track from a demo?
Well, the interesting thing is, so many records I've been involved with, the demo was so passionate because it was the first time that the band went into the studio. Right. They loved what they were doing. And when it came time to make the record, they were stressed out and worried about it. It wasn't the first time. They began questioning things. In the studio world, we call it red light fever. When the record red light goes on, you tighten up and you're always trying to avoid that. So often the passion of the demo is great, but the recording quality of it doesn't match the passion. So you don't really have a master because things are garbled. You can't hear quite the way you like. You don't have the freedom to mix exactly like you want because you only had so many tracks or whatever, or you're using gear that was substandard.
Yeah.
Or it was too early in their career, and they sing it better now. So it's very hard, because once the band has the demo, that's what's imprinted in their mind.
Right.
And now you have to convince them that there's another approach to the song or a more fleshed out approach to the song that will sound better. And it's a very tricky thing. Now, a couple of times, even with me and all my experience, I've made a record with somebody and decided that the demo was still more exciting. So on maybe one track on an album, we would use the demo, and we might redo the vocal or overdub one thing on it, but maybe we just believed that particular performance was better. That happens too, you know.
You know, I was thinking like as far as getting the track done. And I just lost my thought.
Are you talking about your track, Matt, or
Yeah.
or a track in general?
Well, no, I mean I'm talking about my track, and I'm just I know the thought will come back to me, but I did have a question I wanted to ask you, Bill. Okay, so I had a friend of mine tell me that I look like a metal version of Jerry Garcia. I was just wondering if I know you've worked with him a little bit, so I was just wondering if you could confirm or deny that that's true or not.
I could kind of confirm that, although, of course, Jerry's beard was shaped very differently.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely.
She gave me the specs.
She gave you the specs,
and I put the specs on, and I did it for one episode. I was like, I'm not feeling it.
Well, there's always, we never know where Kingdom of Rock is going to go. I didn't expect that question.
Well, no, all I'm saying, my question is, obviously, you know, I wasn't into the Grateful Dead until my friend was hanging out with me for a while, the girl that told me that. So I was, she was exposing me to all that stuff. And what was it like to work with those guys? Like that? Well, tell us a little bit about that.
It was a very interesting experience. I was the right age, you know, when I first got out here to absorb a lot of things and be influenced. And I liked the Grateful Dead a lot when I was on the East Coast, and I was dreaming of coming to California. But the first band that excited me was Moby Grape, because their record came out before the Grateful Dead, and it was such a spectacular debut album with all that singing and being a lead singer. I went, wow, they've got like 3 lead singers or 4 lead singers, crazy. Then I heard the Grateful Dead, and I liked that too. When I got out to San Francisco, I thought the first thing I need is a demo, right? Because I didn't have anything to show people who I was. Back in New York, I had connections and all kinds of things. So I listened to a bunch of records, and I loved the way, and I think this is around 1970 that I'm talking about. And American Beauty had just come out. The Grateful Dead had gotten into their country rock phase. And my music was kind of in that vein. I was into the band and Dylan and stuff. So I listened to it, and the engineer for that particular record was Stephen Barncart. And I, you know, just being young and ridiculous, I said, I'm going to call this guy and have him make me a demo. Like, he needs to do this. And so I looked him up in the Marin phone book. There weren't a lot of Barncarts. Called him up, picked up the phone, and he said, who are you? What? And I told him, I'm out here. I want to do this. I like the sound of that record. He said, well, can you make a cassette of a few of your songs and send them to me? And I did that, you know. And he called me back and said, hey, these are good songs. What do you want to do? I said, well, I want to record like 5 or 6 of them, like an EP's worth, and use that as my calling card. So he suggested we go to Funky Jack's studio in The Hague, and we went in there and we did it with some friends of mine who were very good players, but nobody from the scene out here that you would know necessarily. And he said, okay. He took it. I took it. I took it around. No particular reaction. So I wound up down at the cannery passing the hat and busking and stuff like that while I waited for my ship to come in. And one day I get a call from David Ray. David Ray, like R-E-A, David Ray. And he says, hey, this is David Ray. Are you Bill Cutler? I said, yeah. He goes, are you the guy that made the demo with Stephen Barncart? I said, yeah. How'd you get the demo? He goes, well, I got it from Bob Weir. I said, how did Bob Weir get the demo? Nice. He said, he got it from Steve Barncart. And he gave it to me because I'm getting signed by Clive Davis to Columbia Records. I'm making an album, and I'm looking to put a band together to go out on the road with me. And I want people that are into this genre of music. And I also have to finish my record. I need people to play on it. Would you be interested in coming up to audition? I said, would I? God. You know, he said, well, you know, this would be my band. You'd be the rhythm guitar player, and you'd certainly sing a lot of backup and all that kind of thing. But this is I said, I'm interested. So I went up to a long day of audition. and there were like 15 guys there, and they were all great players. I mean, there were people like Pete Sears and Matthew Kelly and Chris Harold, and people who later on really, really made a name for themselves. And after the whole long day of auditions, he looked at the room and he goes, I want you. And he pointed at me, he goes, and I want you. I love your song, Riding High. I want to put that in my set. I said, okay, what does that mean? And he said, well, come down to the record plant next Monday. We're going to be putting some guitars down, and it's going to be Barncard and Bobby Weir and me and I don't know, Spencer Dryden and 3 or 4 other people. I said, okay. I showed up at the record plant. I was in the band. It was the wildest thing. I mean, it felt so surrealistic, but I felt comfortable with everybody. That's where I met Matthew Kelly and Chris Harold and all those guys, because Matthew and Chris were in the band. A lot of the record was already made, but they had done a cover of the Stones, Under My Thumb. And when they heard it back in New York, they said, nope, there's a women's movement now. We can't have that track on the record.
Right.
So you have to do something else. You have to write a song immediately, and you have to go in and cut it immediately. So David looked at me and said, well, you're the other songwriter in the band. Let's write a song tonight. So we sat down and we wrote this song called Tell Me Where Do All the Good Times Go. It was kind of a little bit reggae. He had been to Jamaica, and we put that, and we played it for Weir and we played it for Barncard, and they liked it. So we cut it a couple of days later. And that's how I sort of got into that world, And Slewfoot, David Ray and Slewfoot, which was the name of the band, the album came out. It was starting to go up the charts. And the Columbia Records Convention came to San Francisco, and they put us on the bill. So it was the Sons of Champlin, Copperhead, John Cipollina's band after Quicksilver, David Ray and Slewfoot, us, and some of it. And we played at the convention. And while we were at the convention, Columbia Records fired Clive Davis. So by the end of the convention, everything was in turmoil. They hired a new president for Columbia Records, and within 3 or 4 months, all the bands I just mentioned were dropped. They dropped the Sons of Champlin, they dropped Copperhead, they dropped Slewfoot, all of them. It left me in a ridiculous position. I mean, I was, 23 years old, and I was already dropped,
Right.
So I was in, but at this point, I had gotten to know the new writers, the Grateful Dead, just by osmosis, because we were in that world. So I decided I would team up with a few people like Matthew and Chris and try to start writing songs and seeing where we could go. So that's how I got into that situation. And from there, Matthew Kelly and I worked on his solo record, Wing and a Prayer, at the record plant. And on that record, since Slewfoot had never gotten to do my song Riding High, and that had become part of our repertoire, Matthew said, I want to cut your song Riding High. On my album, I want you to sing it. I'm going to play harmonica, and we're going to put a great band together. He said, Weir wants to play one acoustic, and you can play another. We'll have 2 acoustics. I said, great. He said to me, who do you want for lead guitar? And I said, how about Jerry Garcia? And they said, well, we'll call him and see. And I said, but Jerry would be perfect on this song, because it had a big ride out where he could do a nice song. So Bobby called Jerry, and I said, Bobby, remind him that I met him at the Matrix in 1968. By now it's like 1972 or 3 or something.
Right.
72.
He's had a few trips since then.
Yeah. But I'm just like, so he says, he met you, and Jerry goes, oh, okay. He goes, well, he thinks about it, and he says, I'll do it. So it was at the record plant in Sausalito, which is like a brand new studio. It's like a rocket ship that just got open. I showed up. The session was called for noon. I showed up at noon. Jerry showed up at noon. Nobody else came till 1:30. So I had an hour and a half along with Jerry. Nice. I had my Martin. He had his guitar. They started miking us up in the studio as we were sitting there talking. He said, well, play me the song. And
Yeah.
I was so nervous because I thought Matthew and and Weir would all be there to help me arrange it. I mean,
Right.
it's just like freaking out. So I said, okay. I played him the song. He starts to play along. He says, how do you envision this? And I thought, he's asking me. Okay. I said, well, I kind of hear like a Steve Cropper backstroke guitar and, some of your signature licks against the vocal. He goes, do I get a solo? I said, you get the entire ride out. Matthew's going to play the 8-bar harmonica solo in the middle, and you're going to do the ride out, and you guys are going to trade. He goes, great. He says, okay, let's go. Do it again. And he just sits there, and he's staring at me, never looks at his fingers, and he starts to play. And by the second time through, it's sounding great. And I'm thinking, I wish somebody was recording this because, the other guys haven't even arrived at the session. So maybe by the 6th time through, he's got everything down. And every time he gets to the end, he plays a completely different solo. I don't mean he changes the licks a little. I mean, it's completely different. One of them sounds jazzy and one of them sounds kind of like the stuff he plays on St. Stephen, and one of them sounds country rock. And I can't pick. I mean, it's all great, and so as the people walk in, Dave Torbett arrives to play bass. They plug him in, and he sits down and starts playing with us. And it just develops organically like that. Matthew comes in, figures out what harmonica he needs and starts to play. The keyboard player comes and the piano's already mic'd and he just starts to play. And Jerry will say, maybe stay off the left hand there. And I start saying things. And before you know it, the two of us are producing the rest of the band,
Mm-hmm.
And within about 2 or 3 hours, we've got everybody in there. Everybody's mic'd up. And we're doing this live in the studio with a scratch vocal for me. I'm in a booth, but there's a window, and we run through and we get an incredible take. And we start playing it back and everyone goes, okay, that's the master track. Now, Bill, we're going to leave your scratch vocal for today and you'll come in and you'll do your vocal when it's not so crowded in here. Why don't we drop a background on? What do you think? So they start calling up all these great singers in the Bay Area and they all come in and they do the background vocal on it. And so it was a very exciting process. And at some point during the day, everything just sort of clicked for me and I started getting really comfortable. That thing I'm talking to you about not having red light fever. And suddenly these are just the guys playing with me.
Steve Vai called it the ultra. He calls it the ultra zone, I think.
Yeah, the
it's
ultra
kind
zone.
of like that. It's kind of that absence of fear. It's just certainty, right. and you're not. You care about the outcome, but you're not stressed about it.
What's so interesting about it is, it took years for that album to come out because Matthew Kelly's album, which is a great album, We're Gonna Prayer, was made on spec at the record plant. And once they saw how many great players he was going to bring in, they were angry and they wanted him to pay off to Bill, and he couldn't do it. He didn't have a label, on and on. When it finally came out, they had put, it was on Relics or something. I don't remember where. And they didn't use my lead vocal. They had Weir sing it, which was fine. Bobby sang it really well. But my scratch vocal was still on tape. And years later, when a second version came out on Kingfish's album, Sundown in the Forest, Matthew heard the scratch vocal and said, I want to use that. I said, no, please, not the scratch vocal. Let me go in and sing it. No, man, I like the scratch vocal. It's emotionally perfect. It's, it's after you've been sitting there for a long time, you got really comfortable. It's a great vocal. They had a good mic on you, and that's the vocal on the second version, There's a third version on my own album, from those sessions, because there were so many takes of the thing. But that's what it was like, sort of getting accustomed to those people. And then shortly after we finished Matthew's record, Kingfish formed, And when I really got embedded in the scene was I started writing songs with Matthew and Weir and John Perry Barlow. And, one of those songs wound up on the Kingfish record. And so at that point, I was in the scene. Simultaneously, my brother John had come out from the East Coast, and he was working at, Alembic and working with Ron Wickersham, developing electronic stuff. He was soldering and working on stuff, Macintosh amps, and he got to know the Dead also, completely separate from me. It had nothing to do with me. And by the time 1973, 4 came around, he was starting to get employed as the guy fixing the amps and things like that,
That's
So
right.
that's how-
It's funny because I don't want to spend too much time on this because we should, but I don't want to be bragging about San Francisco. But it was amazing back then because I know even before I was at Guitar Player magazine, Jerry Garcia would drop down and jam amongst all the magazines in the in the garage.
Right,
Guitar
right.
Player, yeah, or BB King would drop by, or any number of people would drop by.
Right.
It wasn't like let my assistant call your assistant. Let's make sure the paparazzi aren't there. And it was so organic.
Exactly. And also, every one of the bands encouraged people to come down and jam with them. They weren't territorial about their material.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were talented and you had something to offer, there was a place for you,
It kind of sounds like I haven't been there yet, but everyone tells me the baked potato is kind of like that in LA. Is that is that true, Mike?
I don't know.
I don't know, Bill.
Yeah.
That's where like Gambale and all the like killer players, fusion players play.
Yeah, I think it's once again, not to be pro San Francisco, but I think I know a couple of people who have played there, but there's still that element of players trying to cut other players, like it's the old blues guys in the 30s and 40s and stuff. And whereas what Bill and I are talking about, I don't think there was a lot of that. I'm Jerry Garcia. I'm going to cut you in half. That kind of stuff didn't happen.
It was more of a hippie vibe than a like trained killer vibe.
Much more.
Yeah.
And but hippie vibe makes it sound more superficial than it was.
Yeah.
Because there was just a lot of talent at one time, and everybody had ambition. Everyone was trying to make it, but it wasn't a cutthroat thing. It wasn't a vicious thing, and there was a lot of support for you. I'd sit down and I'd say something to Jerry like, "God, I wish I could, play chords the way Weird does." He goes, "You will one day." That would be his answer to that. And he said, "What you do is cool." Nobody thought that you had to be like someone else. Mm-hmm. You could be an individual and be who you were. I was quite different than those guys. They hadn't grown up in New York. They didn't have the same musical background I did, but the combination was cool.
Yeah. Something else I wanted to kind of get into your brain about. It's amazing that more musicians don't learn this, but as you mentioned earlier, it's like you got to have empathetic musicians and you have to have a good song. And certainly at my time at Guitar Player, people really didn't worry about songs so much. It was, can I burn and make people's jaws drop open?
Right.
But when you're looking at songs today, from any artist you're working with, what are some of the, let's say, problems that you see that a songwriter should be careful of when they're trying to get their song as awesome as they possibly can?
Right. Well, the first stuff is obvious. You have to have a great idea for your song. You have to have a theme, something that you want to say. The second thing is you have to have a good chorus. All the songs that we think of that were great hits over the years, when hits really built bands, they all had great choruses, great lyrics, great melodies. And one of the mistakes a lot of people make is, in today's world, they don't write a full song. If you go back and you listen to any of the songs by the Beatles or the early Stones or Led Zeppelin, all kinds of people, there's always some version of like a verse, chorus, bridge, solo, chorus out, or it's theme lick, verse, chorus, theme lick, verse, chorus. There's a sense of structure to the songs, but it's the right structure for that song. And I meet a lot of young songwriters today with great ideas, but they don't ever write a bridge. They don't even know what a bridge is, because so much of the hip hop and sort of stripper pop music, that's out there now. I mean, it doesn't have a bridge. It has maybe a repeating 3 or 4 chord thing that's the verse. Maybe it goes one other place for the chorus, and that's it. There's additions and subtractions. There's breakdowns. There's things, but there's very little of the structure that made so many songs so great. There's hardly ever a surprise, There's no modulations. All the things that were used constantly by songwriters
which
are not so used now,
No, it's who is the girl that just came out that was super successful, won all the awards, young girl, songwriter, pop star.
Do you mean Billie Eilish?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so like
Cover of Vanity Fair this month, by the way.
Yeah.
it just goes to show you how kind of being just a little bit just being unique, how far that can take you in songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
And she does, I don't know, I really like her song structures. Like
Yeah.
it does seem to, it keeps you engaged and it's interesting, but it's like it's kind of almost like you want it to be not too weird, but just a little bit weirder than everyone else.
Well,
And
I think
is that true?
Yeah, I think she's being true to herself. I mean, once again, I don't want to be like the grandpa talking, but when I started out, no one I knew ever wanted to sound like anybody else.
Right.
Right.
And then we kind of got into this thing maybe in the 80s where there were hits where a snare drum had to sound a certain way and a vocal had to sound, and then all of a sudden it was like, well, if we don't sound like what's on the radio today, we're not going to get a hit. I mean, I hate it.
Right.
I hated all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that, as Bill mentioned, like the surprises, I think in songs are really important. I think that, whether it's a modulation, as Bill mentioned, or just a weird sound somewhere. I mean, I think people like to hear.
The thing is,
something unique.
Think of any great hit record. Not only is the song great, but the sound is unique. Day Tripper sounds like Day Tripper. And Won't Get Fooled Again sounds like Won't Get Fooled Again by they have unique sounds to them and beautiful structures. And today, it's hard to define a unique sound because most people sample something else that you've heard a million times before, and that's what the drum sound is. So who knows what their drummer really sounds like, It certainly doesn't sound like Jeff Porcaro, whoever they're sampling. And it's just a weird thing for me because I like each record to be unique. And just like there's some record producers who, when they make a record, they do the same thing on every record. And I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying you take someone like Todd Rundgren, who has a sound in the Utopia era, and a lot of the vocals he recorded on bands as a producer over the years, whether he was producing the I don't know, whoever, he'd use the same technique, the same mic technique, the same grouping on voices and stuff. And then you have people like Daniel Lanois, and he never does that. He goes into a church and makes a record with somebody, and then he makes the next record in a completely different environment and doesn't use any of the same gear that he used before. He's just not afraid to break the rules every single time. And that's when you really get something great, is when you start thinking about the specific song you're working on and get a vision for it. And a lot of the young writers just think that, they're going to strum their guitar, they're going to write the next song, but they're not putting a signature lick in there. There's no.
We've been getting to a lot of artificial intelligence composition tool discussion on this new app called Clubhouse, and it's about like how do you train a computer to help you write or emulate your patterns in a way that could help you create and stuff. And then there's a plugin for everything that and it's like, hey, don't learn how to mix, just hit this button and it'll make you sound like so and so, right?
Right.
And it's like, like all of those tools out there, it could take an inexperienced person down the wrong road. But it also can create commercially viable products. And it's like maybe it's a different motive for that person or something. I don't know. What do you think?
I certainly love technology, and it's made my life so much better. It's allowed me to record artists without big budgets, all these kinds of things. So I'm not putting down technology. And I was one of the first people from my generation to adapt Pro Tools, adapt to Pro Tools. A lot of guys who were my age when Pro Tools came out, they just said, oh, that's a bridge too far. I'm an analog guy. I'm not going to learn a whole new system. I thought, from around 1996, 7 on, when they finally got the sampling rates great, and when Pro Tools started to really sound competitive with analog, not the same, but competitive, that's when I switched to it for many things, not for everything. Often I would put stuff down on analog and then dump it into Pro Tools for the editing process or something, but sometimes strictly into Pro Tools. My feeling is that you have to use technology to enhance a great performance. You shouldn't use technology instead of a great performance. And it's very hard to make people understand that. I mean, yes, of course you can hang auto-tune on an entire vocal, but it's not as powerful as hearing someone sing really well. And then if there's a note or two that isn't right, you punch them. And if they don't get it, okay, so you auto-tune those 3 lines in the song. I do that all the time to make we expect a certain level of perfection in our records right now. But go back and listen to the Shirelles singing Soldier Boy. It's so flat. You can't believe it by today's standards. It was a #1 record, So it isn't about all these things. It's about something that you communicate with the vibe and with what you're saying, with the emotion. And if technology can make it better, great. And when I've done hip hop records. I did the Dylan hip hop track, I did like a Rolling Stone as a hip hop record and with a Bob Dylan sample and all stuff in there. I can enjoy that. But the record also had emotion on it. I had real guitars on it and stuff like that. So it was a mixture. And that's probably my favorite approach, a mixture between good performance and the best use of technology.
Well, I think getting back to writing, I think a lot of writers who don't put in bridges or whatever. It's almost like they kind of look to the producer. They look to someone like you and go, here's my song. I'm expecting you to put the weird stuff in, which on one level is great. On another level, it means the writer hasn't really owned their own work.
Right. So the first meeting I ever have with an artist that I'm considering producing is, I say to them, what is it you're trying to accomplish? Don't tell me how many records you want to sell. Tell me what you want your record to sound like. What do you want it to communicate? And you would think that would be the easiest question to answer, but it's not. And if they say, well, I want to make sure that, I said, no, I want to know what you want your record to sound like. And so after I get them to really come out of their shell and express themselves, I say, okay, if you hire me as a producer, I'm going to make sure you make that record. So, for example, if you tell me, I want a real stripped down, raw punk record, I go, okay, we can make that. But then in the middle of the record, you get nervous and say, I think we should have some blue giraffes over here. And maybe we should put some strings here. I'll say, wait a minute. How do the blue giraffes fit into the stripped down punk record? And they go, oh, I guess they don't. I said, you can change your mind, but remember what your vision was. You believed in the other thing. And that's kind of how you get an artist to come out of their shell,
I think that's hard though, because I think that a lot of artists, they know they want to be respected. They know they want people to enjoy their music, but I don't think a lot of them, and Matt and I have talked a lot about this, even just musicians with their business sense about not really knowing, what they have to do to get their shit together to, you know,
Wow.
be organized. And I think from a creative level, I can see where that question would be difficult to answer. I can see where an artist would get paranoid in the middle of the session and go, I need the giraffes because
I can see
Right.
Sid Vicious writing a draft in my mind.
Right.
writing it, yeah.
But he'll
And
do
again, it just kind of gets back to the creator. You know, you kind of have to know what the hell you want to do, and that's like you said, it sounds so simple, but you know, we've all run into people who are just they're all over the place.
Exactly.
You know, they have no idea.
Exactly. But I'm always more impressed by the artist that knows what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and you know, then you can make a real contribution because you're going down a road and you can help them get there. You know.
No, I think I'm finding that in business and in art that knowing what you are trying to do is so essential.
Of course.
And it's so simple, but it's amazing how many people just have not committed to a path.
And you realize that when you make a record, most of what you do as a producer is cut things away, eliminate things, say, you know, that solo's too busy. You know, that rhythm part, you got those extra chukka-chukkas in there, and they're fighting with the drums. Play less. Right. And, you know, as you clear out the underbrush, you leave the gem and the real intent of the groove. You know, there's the groove you're playing, and there's the underlying groove, the intent. And I always try to get people back to the intent. Not that they can't embellish, not that they can't, you know, go further, but try to get back to that essence. Because think about early rock and roll. You know, Little Richard, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry. Those are very basic records, you know, but we still listen to them. Elvis's Sun recordings. What are there? 4 instruments on there, you know? Mm-hmm. So you have to get people back to the essence of what it really is. And it's hard to do because it's so much fun to get caught in all these crazy things. And once in a while, you have a tremendous inspiration in the studio and you add something you never expected and it's great. And I'm fine with that.
Yeah, it's almost like if we applied that to our live broadcast here, it's like we have all these cool special effects, but the conversations are terrible. You know, it's like we have it looks good, but it's just doesn't resonate with people. And so you've got to focus on the gist of what you're doing. With us, it's about having a good conversation with, you know, artists and, you know, business gurus and, you know, people that know stuff so that Kingdom of Rock can get smarter at music, tech, and business, you know? And,
well, yeah. The intersection of music and business is always an edgy place.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you go out and you see a band that you might want to sign to your label and you sign them because of something that really excited you about that band. And that band may then decide that they want to do something different, you know, and that becomes a very tense thing. Or the label may feel that you're not delivering a commercial enough product. Well, the person that's in the middle of those two things is the record producer. And you have to maintain an artist-friendly attitude, and you have to support your artist's vision, but you also have to deliver a product that makes sense to a record company.
Yeah.
So it's in that creative tension between what an artist can think of and what they might want to do and what a record label's expecting to receive. Yeah. You know? Yeah. Where all that starts to play out.
I mean, there was, you know, owning studios in San Francisco, I would see A&R people come in all the time for bands on, you know, who got deals. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of times a little depressing because the A&R person would sit back there, maybe half crocked, maybe not.
Right.
No, man, you don't want that. We need to put an acoustic guitar on there, or we need to do this, or no, it's all wrong. And, you know, they would just, there were a lot of good A&R people, but there were a lot of A&R people out there that just destroyed bands too. You know?
Right. And when an artist becomes more successful quickly, the A&R people get very nervous because they want to sustain that success. You know, early on in Jewel's career, she came out and she had that big hit, you know, right off the bat. Mm-hmm. And my friend Norm Kerner, who owned Brilliant Studios, you know,
in Richmond.
No, it was no. He owned Starlight in Richmond, but then
Oh, that's right, Starlight in Richmond, right?
Brilliant was down on the Toma in the city.
Yes, true.
Big room. You know, he got a gig cutting one song for Jewel right after she became really big, and it was for a record that was a Fleetwood Mac tribute album, and all these big stars were picking one song off of Rumors and redoing it, and she was doing "You Make Lovin' Fun," you know, and Norm cut it, and he put a great band together. You know, he had, I don't remember, Chuck Prophet, and he had, you know, just a great players, you know, Dave Ravelli, and just all kinds of things. And he was exhausted by it, and the A&R people would keep calling him up and saying, now make sure Jewel does this, make sure Jewel does that, you know. And Norm was producing it, and he just wanted to be left alone. But her manager, her mother, you know, they all came in, they were into this new age stuff. They bring in crystals and walk around the studio. So finally it came time to mix it. He was so exhausted. He called me and he goes, would you mix this record for me? I just, you know, I've had enough, you know? So I went in with Gary Mankin, great engineer, and we mixed it. And it was a terrific track. I mean, he had made a great record, but there was so much on it. You could mix it one way and it would sound completely this way, and you could mix, because she had a pannings of the background vocals where she tracked herself many times. And each time we mixed it, the record label would call up and say, well, it's perfect, except we want the vocal louder.
Right.
Or it's perfect, except, you know, the cello should be up. So this is before automation. Each time we mix the record, we'd have to photograph the entire board, you know, where is every fader, so that we could go back and just update. And it was
like
exhausting.
Polaroids.
And yes, like the Polaroids. And we mixed that record 7 times, one track, before it got accepted. I can't even remember. Maybe Norman went back and actually did the last mix over our mix. You know what I mean? He made even more changes. It came out sounding really great. But the point was,
sorry, go ahead.
It came out great. But the stress around that record was just incredible, because the record company had one vision, she had another. It was a song she hadn't written. It was going on a tribute album that Lindsey Buckingham had the final say on what went on. You know, it was just so many layers involved. And that's what happens when you work with a big star, you know? That's why working with a new band is a lot more fun, because, you know, there's nobody in there messing around with you.
Yeah. You know, you know, Scott Matthews, of course, right?
Sure.
So San Francisco producer, and one of my favorite stories about him is he was doing a record for, I'm not going to mention who it was, but Scott sent the same 3 mixes into the label to like a real famous A&R person who I'm also not going to mention. Right. And Scott sent 3 mixes and said, hey man, I got to tell you, I feel it in my bones. Number 2, it's the hit.
Yeah.
So the A&R guy calls him back and goes, Scott, got to disagree with you, man. It's number 3. And Scott goes, oh man, you're killing me here. Number 2's the one. Number 2's the one. You got to put number 2 out. And A&R person said, nah, I'm sorry, man. I got to disagree. It's number 3. So the record comes out. It stiffs. In a rare moment of contrition, the A&R person calls Scott back and says, you know, Scott, I'm really sorry. You were right. I should have picked number 2.
Dude.
Wow. Yeah.
But I see that Dan DeShara said, hi, Bill, says you got a great set of ears. And I know we're at the top of the hour, but, you know, what was the kind of the defining moment where you feel like you trained your ears to be able to do what you do?
Well, first of all, the reason I wanted to become a producer was because I was never satisfied with the way records I was making as an artist sounded. And I couldn't articulate. I knew what I wanted, but I didn't have the language down to do it, right? To explain that to somebody. So I just started paying attention. And every time I would be in a session of my own, I'd watch everything the engineer was doing. I'd learn why a Pultec was good for this and why, you know, an M49 was the right mic for something else. I would learn that just by watching people, by osmosis.
Well, and those were the days too, where if you looked sideways at a piece of gear, the engineer would kick your ass half the time too.
Right,
Bro.
right. But once I got to know some people in the scene, and once I got into the studio world of, Hyde Street and the record plant and lots of other studios, that were coming up, I would sort of go to other people's sessions and just sit in the back really quietly if I knew somebody and watch. And somewhere around, I'd say 1979, I'd been in the business long enough. I felt, I'm a producer now. I know how to make records. I'd been recording since maybe 1964, maybe 15 years or something like that. It took me that long to have the confidence to say to somebody, you should take my advice,
Right.
And one of the first bands that I produced was the Lloyds. Remember the Lloyds?
Oh yeah.
Like early 80s. I did some things before that, but that was one of the first bands I produced for a label, Trotter Records, a local label. And we did an EP with Attitude Check and some of those songs on there. And Lulu and Ronnie and I had known each other since the mid 70s, when we used to go out in the street together to make money, and we were all broke. So we had a rapport as people, and I worked with them really hard. They had great songs. They were also playing in all the clubs. So they were playing the Stone, and they were playing the Palms, and they were touring Northern California, and they were getting tighter and tighter. And I would go out to their gigs, and I'd make suggestions and things. But we had a real rapport. So once I'd done that record and it got a great response, I thought, okay, I'll split my time between performing and producing. I'm now convinced I can do this. And then along came Chrome Dinette and Vauxhall, and all these other bands that I did. And it just sort of became something that I did. It wasn't like I'd planned out that I was going to move from performance to production. And I didn't really, because I was in the New Models after that, and I performed. And then I was in the Lost Souls with Robbie Dunbar, that band. So I kept being in bands, but more and more of my time was spent in the studio. I saw how many of my friends were burning out on the road, and, Coke was coming to the scene and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to just get better at making records, So I took that opportunity. So 1979, I don't know, that's probably when I became a producer, something like that.
Should we wrap it up, Matt? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we're 7 minutes over right now, so it's okay.
The record company's not going to like that. You're going to have to cut 7 minutes.
We just used all of our tape, and so we're just going to have to call this good, guys. So yeah, hopefully it's good.
Okay.
No, it's great. So Bill, thanks so much for being on the show, and definitely loved hearing your stories, and I'm definitely adopting some of your producer advice from this interview, so I'll let you know how that works out for me.
Just do what I do. Just do what Bill fucking tells you.
Oh my God. I don't know about that. I really enjoyed it though, guys. And it's great that you're doing these things, because it's one of the only ways creative people are getting to interact right now. So I'm glad this exists.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time, and it's great to be able to touch base, because, like I said, we've known each other forever. This is yet another thing that we've done that we haven't done before. So,
yeah.
It's great. Hey, now he's on our show. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, you wrote a couple of great articles on me too. The one in Guitar Player was wonderful after my album came out.
Oh yeah. I even forgot about that.
I have.
Quickly before we, where can people get a hold of you, Bill? Do you have a website you want to push or anything?
Well, I do have a website, just billcutler.com, but I don't do a whole lot there. Facebook is a better place to find me, because, things are happening too fast for the other thing. So you can find me there, and that's probably the best way, And then my album, Crossing the Line, is on Spotify, and a couple of my videos are pretty easy to find on YouTube. If you put me in, and they'll come up, So those are places people can find me right now.
Cool. Well, thanks, Bill, for being on the show. Matt Gibson, Michael Melinda, Bill Cutler, Kingdom of Rock out, and you guys have a great week. We'll see you every Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And you can also check us out on Clubhouse. So look for Matt Gibson on Clubhouse. And I think Mike, we're almost getting him over there. Are you close, Mike?
I'm being the cranky. I'm bringing the cranky old punk rocker as far as Clubhouse. But you're there. That's all that matters.
Right.
And by the way, Matt, why don't you tell people who the guest is next week?
Wait a minute. I have to think about this.
Corinne.
Oh, yes. Corinne Campbell from Indepreneur is going to be on here next week. Amazing artist, amazing entrepreneur, and be sure to check her out. She's got a great community of independent musicians.
Now we're good. We can go bye-bye.
Okay.